Hello and welcome back for some more speculation around the expansion draft this summer for the Seattle Kraken as they enter the league, as we go team by team to see what players might be protected, and more importantly, what players could be available for Seattle to pick from. Now I'm going to try to cut to the chase a little bit quicker than I usually do because we do have a number of players to talk about in this one. Because when it does come to my soon-to-be former favorite team, the Colorado Avalanche, the only way this team does not lose a good player to Seattle is if they make a deal. But real quick, if you do find yourself enjoying this video for any reason and you like to do that kind of thing, the subscribe button down there can probably help you out. Now coming into this current season that we're in, the Avalanche were one of, if not the favorites to win the Stanley Cup. And even if things have gotten off to a bit of a rocky start for them, by looking at this roster, it's easy to see why people thought so highly of them. Because not only are they strong at the top end with names like Cale Makar, Mikko Rantanen, and of course Nathan MacKinnon, but they also have very, very good depth. And it's that second thing that is music to the ears of Seattle. So they definitely will not be able to protect everyone, but as we do start to get to the protection list, even while 4-4 is not out of the question for this team, I do think that 7-3 is very likely the way they'll be going. So then on the forward end, of course, there are going to be some locks to be protected, like Nathan MacKinnon, Mikko Rantanen, and Gabriel Landeskog, assuming he does re-sign, as well as probably Nazem Kadri and Andrei Burakovsky. And then when it comes to those last two spots on the forward end, this is where things get a little bit interesting, because I do actually think that there are a number of guys that really any combination of two of them could end up filling those spots. And I will end up talking about all of them coming up here, but for now I think the most likely two to end up filling them will be Tyson Jost, largely due to his youth. And then at least right at this moment anyway, for me, I have Jonas Donskoi in that second spot for a couple of reasons. One, because of the start he's gotten off to this season compared to that of JT Compher, who would be the other one potentially in that spot. And then also the fact that the Avalanche do have him locked up for the next couple of seasons at just under $4 million per. But either JT Compher or Brandon Saad might be the more popular picks here. And then the final guy on the forward end that probably at this point is a little bit more on the outside, but could still maybe get one of these protection spots would be Valeri Nichushkin. And when it comes to this group as a whole, really the only pair that I would have a hard time seeing being the two protected would be Saad and Donskoi. And that's just because they are a little bit older than the rest, and also on the biggest contracts. Which for the Avalanche, who again probably still want to re-sign Landeskog at some point this season, could end up making a difference with the flat cap coming up. Especially with Saad also going to be looking for a new contract, and unless he's willing to take a discount from the $6 million he's making this year, could be looking for a decent chunk of money. But as we do roll on now to the defensive end for the Avalanche as well, things are a little bit more straightforward here. Really the only question here is whether or not Erik Johnson would be willing to waive his no movement clause, or really even if the Avalanche would even ask him to, though I kind of think they probably will. But again, because no movement clauses are there for a reason, I'm not going to assume that he does waive it, so he'll get one of the protection spots, and then the other two I think pretty obviously go to Cale Makar and then Samuel Girard. And then in goal, the obvious pick for protection here would be Philip Grubauer, with Pavel Francouz probably on the outside looking in. Though with the goalies, I'm not really sure how much it would matter who ends up protected, but we'll get to that in a second. Real quick before we move on though, sticking to the defensive end, if Erik Johnson were to waive his no movement clause and they decided not to protect him, then the likely guy that would end up getting that protection spot would be Devon Toews. But even if that were to happen, that would still leave the Avalanche with Ryan Graves exposed on the defensive end, which again is another player they probably would not like to see leave. But for now, as we do start talking about which players could end up with their future in Seattle, let's start at the forward end where there's that group of 5 players where, again, 2 of them will end up probably protected, but 3 of them are likely to be exposed. And since for contract and cap reasons, I do think that at least one of these 2 does end up exposed, we might as well start with the 2 oldest and most experienced of the group, in Saad and Donskoi. Both 28 years old, Saad is the more experienced of the 2, now having played in at least part of 10 different NHL seasons. In that time, having played in 606 games with 357 points on 175 goals and 182 assists. A pretty solid two-way forward and a fairly consistent 20 goal scorer, Saad could have a lot to offer the Kraken, especially considering the forward position is the one where they'll probably struggle the most to find good talent, at least in the expansion draft anyway. With a few 50-point seasons in a row early on in his career with the Chicago Blackhawks, Saad's stats have tailed off a little bit over the last few years, but Again, since the Blackhawks have also tailed off and he also played a couple of years in Columbus, that's somewhat understandable. But even at that, he still had 33 points in 58 games last year and has gotten off to a pretty decent start with 10 points in 18 games so far to this point in the season, so he definitely still seems to have plenty left in the tank. Plus, even if his points production were tailing off, which again I think you would have a hard time saying definitively that it has, what he's able to offer a team as a two-way forward doesn't really seem to have, which is evidenced in his advanced stats, where he is always above and usually pretty safely above 50% with his Corsi for percentage, and then with the exception of the 2018-19 season, always positive in expected plus minus. Plus, Saad does also have that bonus that we've talked about before of Stanley Cup Finals experience, having won 2 Stanley Cups with the Chicago Blackhawks. And then on the other side of the coin, you have Donskoy, who is now playing in his 6th NHL season, where he has played 367 games with 167 points on 67 goals and 100 assists. Maybe not quite as much of a goal scorer as Saad, Donskoy too can hold his own at both ends of the ice. Plus, he was at least able to equal Saad's point total from last year with 33 points of his own, though his did come in 65 games with Saad's coming in 58. And more of those points were goals for Saad than they were for Donskoy, but both were able to contribute to the offense. And also, like Saad, Donskoy has gotten off to a strong start this year with 12 points on 6 goals and 6 assists in 19 games. And although he has yet to hold up the cup like Saad has twice now, Donskoy did have a chance to be part of a Stanley Cup Finals team with the Sharks a few years ago. And although, of course, the Sharks did end up eventually losing that series, Donskoy did score the overtime winner that gave the Sharks franchise its first ever game win in a Stanley Cup Finals series. With all else equal, Saad is probably the better and at least slightly more tempting option here. But again, he is in a contract year where he is being currently paid $6 million. Meanwhile, Donskoy would be locked up for another couple of seasons at just under $4 million per. That being said though, even if Saad were to command a similar type of contract to what he's currently on, which would make Donskoy a slightly cheaper option, the Kraken will have quite a bit of flexibility when it comes to their cap situation, so they might be willing to shell out that extra couple of million for the slight improvement for what will be maybe a top line, if not certainly a top 6 forward for them. But when it comes to the Avalanche, there still are a number of other options on the forward end, and younger options as well, 2 of whom are already under contract for what will be the Kraken's first season, which would help them fulfill that particular requirement. Those 2 being the 2 25-year-olds in Comfer and Nichushkin. Between the 2, the one with the more experience and the most similar to the 2 we just talked about would be Nichushkin. Also now in his 6th year in the NHL, Nichushkin has now played in 307 games with 105 points on 38 goals and 67 assists. And from a points per game standpoint, is also coming off of one of his better seasons with 27 points in 65 games. That being said though, he has not gotten off to the strong start that the other 2 have this season with just 4 points in his 19 games. But what he can offer, again similar to the other 2, is a little bit more consistent two-way play, which again does show up in those advanced stats where he has a very solid 52.2 Corsi for percentage and a 23.9 career expected plus minus. And at least as far as the Corsi stats are concerned, this season has looked very good even without the points production with a 58.4 percentage. But if it was a little bit more offense that the Kraken were looking for and he were available, JT Compher could definitely offer that. Now in his 5th season in the NHL, Compher has 95 points on 50 goals and 45 assists in his 242 career games. And while his typical half a point per game pace is not too far off what we've also been able to see from Nichushkin to this point, he has been able to do it much more consistently than Nichushkin has. Though to be fair, at least to this point in the current season, he has matched Nichushkin perfectly with 4 points on 2 goals and 2 assists in 19 games. And while his defensive capabilities and work ethic have been praised by some, they have yet to show up in his advanced stats in quite the same way that they have for the previous 3 players. With all that being said, with Compher in particular, it does seem like there's a little bit more to be tapped into there, and that his ceiling could be a little bit higher than some of these other guys, which is why he certainly still could find his way onto a protection list for a team in the Avalanche that is not quite as worried about its defense going forward. Especially if they are also looking to free up some cap space, as Compher will only be costing them $3.5 million for the next couple of seasons. But if it is more potential and a high ceiling from a young player that the Kraken are looking for, if he's available, former 10th overall pick Tyson Jost could offer just that. But it does have to be said that of at least this group of players on the forward end, I do think that Jost probably has the best shot of being protected. largely because he is again 22 years old and a former 10th overall pick. So even if the rumors are true that the Avalanche might be interested in moving on from him and potentially giving him a change of scenery that could kick his career into gear, they'll probably want to hang on to him and try to trade him to a team and at least get something in return. But of course, especially considering there aren't going to be a whole lot of recent early first round picks available for the Kraken even potentially to be selecting in the expansion draft, there is a reason that we've found our way to where we are with Jost. And that's because in the 5 years that he has played in the NHL, in his 225 games, he's put up just 74 points on 33 goals and 41 assists, which is certainly not quite the points production that the Avalanche were looking for when they drafted him. And he hasn't really been able to make up for it anywhere else either, with his advanced stats also not looking like the type of player that was drafted where he was. And if going into this season his future in Colorado were in question, then, well, things have probably only gotten worse, as he's only been able to put up 2 points on a goal and an assist in 17 games so far to this point. So with Jost, if he were to be available and the Kraken were to take him, it would be Seattle gambling that they can get more out of him than Colorado has been able to. But if they are able to, then there should be a good amount of talent there to tap into. But if the Kraken don't want to take as much of a risk on a player and want to be a little bit more sure of what they're getting when they select from Colorado, then even outside of the couple of guys on the forward end that could offer them that, on the defensive end, there are a couple of very good options that at least one of will be available for them. Those two options being Devon Toews and Ryan Graves. A 4th round pick, Toews took a little bit longer to get to the NHL level. Now in his 3rd season in the NHL at the age of 27, Toews has played in 132 games with 55 points on 15 goals and 40 assists. He impressed in his 2 years with the Islanders, where he had 46 points in 116 games before coming over to the Avalanche before the start of this season, where things have really only gotten better so far to this point this year, where he has 9 points on 4 goals and 5 assists in just 16 games. And it's points production that has been pretty consistent throughout his hockey career, whether it was at university or at the AHL level, both places where he was well above a half a point a game, which for a defenseman is pretty good. And again, if you are into the advanced stats, he's also looked very good there, where he has a career Corsi for percentage above 50 and an expected plus minus that each of his 2 previous seasons was above 10. Now, especially considering the Avalanche just got their hands on Toews and so far it seems to be going very well, there is a pretty good chance that he could end up protected, whether it's again because Johnson might decide to waive that no movement clause, or maybe the Avalanche are tempted into going a 4-4 protection route, though I think that one's a little bit more unlikely. Regardless though, if somehow Toews is protected, I think it's pretty unlikely that Ryan Graves would be. At the age of 25, Graves is also currently in his 3rd season in the NHL, having played 113 games in his career with 34 points on 12 goals and 22 assists. And like Toews, things continue to look good when you get to the advanced stats, where he has a 51.2 career Corsi for percentage and a 4.5 career expected plus minus. So maybe while at least in points production and puck possession, Toews would seem to have the advantage over Graves, especially this season where Graves only has 3 points on 3 assists in 18 games. When it comes to block shots and hits, that's where Graves certainly has the advantage, with over 2 block shots per game over the course of his career and 150 block shots last year, as well as 174 hits over the course of his career, 112 of those coming in last season, where he played 69 games. So even if he isn't quite the points-producing type of player that Toews is, he does offer quite a bit when it comes to physicality and just getting in the way of frozen rubber. It is also worth mentioning that both defensemen will be under contract during the Kraken's first season, with Toews getting $4 million per through 2024, and Graves getting just under $3.2 million through 2023. And I do think that it's fairly safe to say that as long as this roster looks fairly similar and there's no side deals with the Avalanche, that the player the Kraken will pick from them will be one of these 7. Because in goal, even though Francouz or Grubauer, if he were to be the one available, would be a very good selection for the Kraken, the problem is that there are also very good goalies elsewhere where there aren't going to be as good of options when it comes to skaters. So especially when Seattle has a chance to get as good of a player either on the forward or defensive end as they will from Colorado, that's not a chance they will really be able to afford to pass up. So ultimately with the Avalanche, when it does come down to who at least I would like to see the Kraken take from this team, I do think either Taves or, if he's not available, Graves is probably the best option from this team. But that being said, outside of some of the teams that might go the 4-4 protection route, the Avalanche are going to offer some of the best options at the forward end that the Kraken are likely to see in the expansion draft. So if a guy like Saad or Donskoy is able to continue what he's done so far to this point this season, or someone like Comfer, Nichushkin, or Jost is able to pick things up a little bit, then at least from a kind of opportunity cost type of standpoint, one of those guys could offer actually the best option on this team, even if they aren't strictly speaking the better player compared to Taves or Graves. But of course, with a team like the Avalanche, who have a number of good players and not enough protection slots to protect all of them on the defensive or forward end, they will have the potential temptation to try and strike a deal with Seattle to either give them a prospect or a draft pick in order for them to take somebody else, so they don't have to worry about losing any of the guys they don't want to lose. But unfortunately, or I guess more fortunately for the Avalanche, they don't really have a whole lot of bad contracts that they're looking to get out from under. Really, the closest one that I could see would be Erik Johnson, but again, he has that no movement clause, so he would have to be in on the deal. On top of that, well, trading prospects is always an option for what the Avalanche could give Seattle in return for picking someone like Johnson instead of one of their other players. When it comes to the other option, which would be trading draft picks, I don't think the Avalanche are going to be too tempted to be parting ways with too many of those, as they're already missing their second and fourth for next year, and also their second in the year following. So ultimately, I do think that the most likely scenario here is that the Avalanche send out their protection list and then just bite the bullet of Seattle picking whoever they decide to pick. Which once again does mean that Seattle will probably be getting a pretty good player. But that will finally bring me to the end of this one. So if you have made it to this point, as always, thank you very much for watching. If you did like or enjoy this video, there are buttons for that kind of stuff down below. Otherwise, I would love to hear your thoughts on the Avalanche and their protection list, or who Seattle could pick from this team, down in the comments section. Otherwise, stay safe out there and be good to each other. Peace!